So now that you already know the rules for adding and subtracting integers, we need to talk about the rules for multiplying and dividing integers. Now, before we do that, we need to talk about what a negative sign really means. And in truth, a negative sign really means the opposite. So therefore, if I look at my negative 2, what I should say is the opposite of 2, which we know is negative 2. Now, things can get a little bit more complicated when we have more than one negative sign. I've got 2 negative signs here, and that tells me that that's the opposite of 2. So we know up here the opposite of 2 is negative 2. And then the opposite of that, which is, of course, what we were originally given, and the opposite of negative 2 is equal to positive 2. We can complicate things a little bit more by having 1, 2, 3 negatives, which means we've got 3 opposites. So what's going on here? Well, we know when we had those 2 opposites, just like we did up here, that really meant positive 2. I've still got one more negative, and the opposite of positive 2, well, that's where we started, and that's equal to negative 2. Now here we go again. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 negatives this time. Well, I go right back up here. I can look at that negative negative, or the opposite of the opposite. There it is. That's that negative 2, which, as we recall, was positive 2. And then in the last one, we said, well, if I take that positive 2, find the opposite of that, well, that gives me negative 2. The opposite of that, there's my next 2 opposites, well, that's this one again. So that equals positive 2. Now, it should start to become fairly obvious that these opposites keep switching back and forth, negative, positive, negative, positive. Well, what's going on here? We look at the number of negative signs. We've got 1 here, 2, how many? 3. Next one, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. We start looking at the fact that there's odd numbers and even numbers of opposites. So, odd numbers of opposites give me negatives. Even numbers of opposites give me positives. So, that means going forward, we consider what we just learned about those negative signs, how we paired those negative signs together. We apply those very same rules when multiplying or dividing. So that gives us our rules. Multiplying or dividing, when we multiply or divide integers, as always, we deal with those absolute values, multiply or divide as usual, and then we count the number of negative signs. If it's odd, our final answer is negative. If it's even, our final answer is positive. Let's look at some examples. I've got negative 2, and that's multiplied by negative 8. I find the absolute values. That would give me 2 times 8, which of course is 16. I've got 1, 2 negatives, so that's an even number, so my answer is positive 16. Over here, I've got absolute values again, 5 times 7, only one opposite, only one negative, which tells me that's an odd number, so my answer is negative 35. If I go ahead and look at these other examples, I've got negative 14 divided by negative 2. Well, 14, I take my absolute values of both of those. So that's 14 divided by 2, which is 7. I've got 1, 2 negatives. That's an even number. My answer is positive 7. Over here again, absolute value of both, 32 divided by 4 is 8. Only one negative. That's an odd number. My answer is negative 8. Down here, I've got 6 divided by 12. Well, that's not something that I can actually divide, so I really just need to look at reducing that. That becomes 1/2. I only have one negative, therefore my answer is negative 1/2. Over here, again, same thing. My denominator is larger. I really just need to look at reducing. I know that 9 goes into both, so that's 1/6. I've got 2 negatives. My answer is positive 1/6. So if we carry on with the same rules that we were using before, I'll multiply these two numbers together first. Wait for that one. So I find the absolute value of negative 5 and 4. That's, of course, 5 times 4, which is 20. I've got 1 negative sign. That's an odd number. So I have my negative sign times negative 7. Find those absolute values. I've got 20 times 7, which is 140, and I've got 2 negative signs, which makes my final answer positive. Now what I could have done is simply gone right through, done the multiplication, and then gone back and counted 1, 2 negative signs and still known that it was positive. Let's look at the second one. I've got absolute values of positive 12, negative 2, so that's 12 divided by 2, which is 6. Only one negative sign, that's odd, so I've got negative 6 times positive 6. Find those absolute values. 6 times 6 is 36. One negative is odd. My answer is negative 36. And now you should know how to multiply and divide using integers.